My name is Lila. I'm 36. And this is the story of how my family voted me out of existence. It happened on Christmas Eve. The house was full of fake warmth, twinkling lights. A fire crackling like a commercial. Cinnamon-scented candles lined up like soldiers on the mantel. My sister stood up with her wine glass and that curated smile she wears when she's about to control a room. She tapped her spoon once. Twice. And everyone went quiet. Just like they always did for her. Then she said it. We voted. And you're no longer part of this family. No one gasped. No one asked what she meant. My mother nodded and buttered her roll like the sentence was as normal as asking someone to pass the salt. My dad didn't even look up from his plate. My niece giggled like it was a game. I waited for someone to say it was a joke. I waited for someone to defend me. No one did. I didn't speak right away. I remember staring at the ham. At the perfectly folded napkins. At the candle flickering between me and the people who used to be my home. My hands were in my lap. Folded, like a child's. My mouth couldn't move. I wasn't sad. Not yet. Just stunned. They moved on. That's what gutted me. The conversation picked up like nothing had happened. My seat had disappeared from their minds while I was still sitting in it. My mother leaned toward my brother and whispered about dessert. My father reached for the gravy. Roslyn, my sister, was already unwrapping her next verbal present. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why. I just watched them. And a part of me knew that this had been building for years. The looks, the jokes disguised as advice. The way I was always the one left holding the mess and blamed when it didn't shine. I stood up slowly. No one stopped me. I reached for my coat. Still nothing. The hallway smelled like pine and too much perfume. When the door closed behind me, it didn't slam. It clicked shut. Like even the house was tired of pretending. That night, the cold bit through my sweater. But it felt cleaner than the air inside. I walked to my car without looking back. Not out of strength. Just because there was no point. They'd made their choice. What they didn't know was that I had already started making mine. I was always the reliable one. The one who stayed calm when things fell apart. Who knew how to navigate chaos without raising her voice. Even as a kid, I learned to fix things before anyone asked. Because that was how you earned peace in a house that didn't offer it freely. By the time I turned 10, I knew how to unclog a sink, balance my mom's grocery receipts, and explain my sister's outbursts so she wouldn't get in trouble. I got called mature for my age. Responsible. Thoughtful. But what they really meant was that I didn't cause problems. And I quietly cleaned up the ones they made. When I got my first real job after college, I celebrated with a quiet dinner at home and a bottle of cheap wine. My parents didn't ask how I felt, but they did ask for help with a surprise dental bill the next day. I paid it. No one said thank you. I told myself they were just stressed. That was always the story. Roslyn called me 6 months later, crying about her rent being late and her hours being cut. I sent her $1,000. She promised it was temporary. It wasn't. That year alone, I paid for her overdue car insurance, her therapy appointments, and half of her credit card debt. Then came Josh's college tuition. He said the scholarship didn't cover lab fees and books. And Mom asked if I could just help a little. I wired the money the same day. They sent me a blurry photo of him holding a textbook and said they were proud. No one asked how my job was going. No one noticed I'd skipped replacing my broken laptop because the money went to them. Every time there was a crisis, I was the first call. My phone rang when Dad had chest pains that turned out to be gas. It rang when Roslyn got dumped again and needed someone to talk her down from a meltdown. It rang when the dog needed surgery. When the fridge died. When the bank account dipped too low. But it never rang on my birthday. Or when I got promoted. Or when I moved into my own place after years of saving. No one showed up for me the way I showed up for them. I used to think it was love. That being needed meant I mattered. That being the strong one was something to be proud of. But over time, I realized it wasn't love. It was convenience. I wasn't the favorite. I was the fallback. And every act of help I gave was twisted into duty. If I hesitated, even for a moment, I was told I was being selfish. If I asked for space, I was told I was distant. If I pushed back, even gently, I was accused of abandoning the family. Once, I asked Mom if she remembered the time I flew home from Seattle overnight when Dad was in the ER. She smiled and said, "Oh, you always overreact. It wasn't that serious. He was fine." I sat there stunned, remembering how I'd missed a critical meeting at work, paid $400 for a last-minute flight, and spent the night curled up in an ER chair, thinking I might lose my father. To her, it was a blip. To me, it was a line that never uncrossed. The more I gave, the more they expected, and the more I lost parts of myself in the process. I started saying yes before I even thought about what it would cost me. They trained me to think that saying no was a betrayal, that boundaries were cruelty, that my exhaustion was just a phase to push through. I remember bringing Rosalind a book I loved for her daughter's birthday. She looked at it, then at me, and said, "That's sweet. I guess we all give what we can." I just covered her overdue rent that same week. But all she saw was that I hadn't bought the doll her daughter wanted. That was the pattern. Nothing was ever enough. And yet, they always came back for more. Not with gratitude, but with entitlement. Like I owed them some unspoken debt for being born into the same bloodline. I kept thinking it would change. That one day, they'd see me. That they'd remember everything I carried, everything I buried, to make sure they didn't break. But they never did. And the truth is, I don't think they ever will. Because when someone gets used to taking plays, then your silence becomes the currency they spend. Your endurance becomes their excuse. And your collapse becomes your own fault. I didn't realize how heavy it had all become until the moment they pushed me out. That was the moment I saw it clearly. I wasn't just the fixer. I was the only one they never cared to thank. Because they never expected me to stop fixing. I didn't plan on saying anything that night. I wasn't there to fight. But the moment Rosalind stood up with her glass and delivered that carefully rehearsed line, something shifted. Not in the room. In me. That moment they thought they were erasing me was the exact moment I decided to let them see what erasure really looked like. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folder. Thick. Worn at the edges. Paper clipped in sections. I set it on the table, with a quiet thump that sounded louder than anything anyone had said. Everyone went still. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. I didn't say a word at first. Just leaned back and looked at Rosalind. Since we're being honest, I figured I'd come prepared. She didn't laugh. She reached for the folder like it might bite her. Then flipped it open, trying to look casual. She skimmed the first page. And I watched the color drain from her face. Page after page. Transfers from my account to hers. Venmo screenshots. Email threads where she begged for help with rent. With bills. With therapy appointments that turned out to be spa packages in Santa Barbara. Her mouth tightened. But she kept flipping. Then came the hotel receipts. Charleston. Ocean View Suite. 2 names. Hers and a woman named Dana. Booked under a shared account with her husband's name attached. She paused. Looked up at me. Then shoved the folder across the table like it was something filthy. "You're sick." She spat. "You've been spying?" I didn't blink. "I've been documenting." "There's a difference." Josh reached for the folder next. His fingers trembled. His face turned pale as he read. He mouthed words to himself. "Kiet." Disbelieving. Then he looked at Rosalind. He didn't raise his voice. He just stared. Long enough for her to break eye contact and glance away. My mother reached forward like she might grab the folder too, but stopped halfway. "How dare you?" she said. Voice quivering. Weaponizing your help like this. I turned to her. Voice calm. Colder than I'd ever heard myself. You called it help. But to you? I was an ATM. A therapist. A guilt sponge. I didn't choose that role. You assigned it. Dad didn't speak. He leaned back in his chair like he wanted to disappear into the cushion. My niece still thought it was a game. She asked if we were acting. If this was like a show. No one answered her. I stood up slowly. My legs were shaking, but my voice wasn't. You said I wasn't family. I said, scanning the room. So maybe you won't need your fallback anymore. Rosalind's hand clenched around her wine glass. Her lipstick was smudged. Josh flipped back to the hotel page. Mom muttered something under her breath. But no one heard it. No one really wanted to. No one moved. The silence was sticky. Heavy. Almost physical. They hadn't expected a folder. They hadn't expected proof. They'd counted on my silence like it was a permanent trait. Like I was born to keep their secrets. But that night, I decided their secrets didn't belong to me anymore. And I wasn't going to carry what didn't belong to me. Not ever again. Josh kept turning pages. He wasn't just reading anymore. He was absorbing. His mouth moved without sound. Like he was rehearsing the words. Trying to convince himself that what he saw was real. When he got to the hotel receipt, he froze. His eyes narrowed. Then he looked up at Rosalind. Not with anger? With something worse? Disappointment so sharp, it made the room feel smaller. He asked one question. Quiet. Steady. Who is Dana? Rosalind blinked-faced. Said she was a colleague. A consultant. Someone who helped with a project. Josh flipped to the next page. Dates. Charges. Notes. All under a joint account he didn't know existed. He asked again. This time slower. Why were you in Charleston? She didn't answer. Our mother stood like she might jump in. But Josh raised a hand without even looking at her. That stopped her cold. Rosalind finally said it was a misunderstanding. That it looked worse than it was. That I had twisted things. But no one was looking at me now. They were looking at her. The room cracked without sound. A split that started in the center and spread to every wall. The kind that doesn't shake the chandelier or break a plate. But you know it's there. I felt it more than I saw it. The shift. The rebalancing. Aunt Leslie, who had smiled so wide when I walked in, now stared at her hands. Uncle Reggie, who laughed when Rosalind made the announcement, was suddenly sipping his wine like it was all too bitter. Even Nevaeh stopped giggling and whispered something to her mom. She didn't get an answer. Josh pushed the folder away like it burned. He stood up. Slow. Heavy. Like the weight in his chest had reached his spine. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just walked to the window and kept his back to everyone. Rosalind called after him. Her voice cracked. No one moved. No one followed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things no one could take back. And just like that, the perfect family portrait began to peel at the corners. Not from what I brought to the table, but from what had always been underneath it. Waiting. Quiet. Ready to be seen. I walked out of that house without looking back. The cold night air hit my face like a promise. Every step away felt lighter. Like shedding a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. My phone buzzed in my pocket just as I reached the car. It was the lawyer representing the family trust. He reminded me I was still listed as a fallback power of attorney. That unless I signed new papers, some assets would default through me. I took a breath. There was no panic. No hesitation. I told him flatly that I no longer held that authority, and that I would not be involved in any way. I didn't explain why. I didn't apologize. I simply said it was finalized and hung up. For the first time in years, I felt free of obligation. Free of the invisible chains they had tied around me. The power had shifted. I was no longer their safety net. The one they could call when all else failed. I had stopped being the fixer, and they had lost the one thing they thought they controlled. That night, as I sat in my car with the engine off, I didn't feel lonely. I felt relief. The silence outside was louder than any argument inside. I was done bending. Done carrying more than I could hold. I knew the real fight wasn't over. But this moment belonged to me. The power of walking away isn't in the footsteps, but in the decision to never look back. My phone lit up with messages one after another. A photo of the living room without presents under the tree. Another. A recording of a child crying softly in the background. Then came a letter from Mom. Written in shaky handwriting. Begging for help. Not once did any message carry an apology or a simple ask to understand. I read them all. One by one. But the anger I expected never came. Instead, a cold clarity settled in. This wasn't about repair or reconciliation. It was about control. A well-worn tactic dressed up as guilt and sorrow. I recognized the pattern. The empty house photo was meant to stir regret. The crying child was supposed to crack my defenses. The letter. A silent accusation wrapped in fragile ink. But none of it touched me the way it once did. I wasn't fooled anymore. I saw the strings attached to every plea. The way my absence was weaponized to make me feel small. To pull me back into a story I'd already written the last chapter of. I didn't reply. I didn't feel the need to explain. Because I knew this game too well. The guilt card doesn't work when you've learned how to hold your own hand steady through the storm. Instead, I locked my phone and poured a glass of water. The silence was softer than their noise. And for once, it was enough. I pressed record and let my voice fill the silent room. I didn't stammer or hesitate. I wasn't asking for forgiveness or making excuses. I simply said I was done staying silent for the sake of a family that never saw me. I reminded them of the years I held us together while they tore each other apart. Of every bill I paid. Every crisis I managed. Every lie I swallowed to keep peace. I said I wouldn't be the scapegoat anymore. I told them if they continued to threaten me, twist the truth, or gaslight me, I would release every receipt, every message, every recording I had ever kept. There would be no more secrets. No more hiding behind false smiles. My voice didn't shake. It was steady, strong, and clear. I was no villain. I was the consequence of their choices. The result of their refusal to acknowledge the damage they caused. I told them I had hoped for peace. But peace wasn't possible if it meant sacrificing my truth. I would no longer play the part of the fixer, the protector, or the silent sufferer. I was reclaiming my story. I warned them this wasn't a bluff. I was prepared to stand firm. I wasn't asking for their approval or their pity. I was demanding respect. And if respect wasn't possible, then they would have to face the truth. When I hit send, the silence that followed was loud enough to fill every empty room they ever left me in. It was the kind of silence that makes people think twice. The kind that signals change. I didn't know what would come next. But I felt lighter than I had in years. Saying enough wasn't weakness. It was the bravest thing I'd ever done. For the first time, I was speaking for myself. Not as a daughter, a sister, or a fixer, but as Lila. The knock came late in the afternoon. Soft but persistent. When I opened the door, there was Casey standing there with a worn duffel bag slung over her shoulder and eyes heavy with exhaustion. She didn't smile or explain right away. She just stepped inside like she was finally safe. She admitted she had stayed silent for years. Too scared to speak up. Too afraid of the fallout if she sided with me. But after my message, after watching me stand my ground, she realized she couldn't keep pretending anymore. She needed out too. We sat down. Neither of us rushing to fill the quiet. It was strange. That silence between us? Not heavy but soft. Like the space where trust begins to grow again. For the first time in a long time, there was no distance. No walls, just two sisters who had been broken but were starting to heal. Casey told me about the fear that had kept her chained to the family's secrets. The pressure to stay loyal by staying quiet. She spoke about nights spent wondering if speaking out meant losing everything. But watching me find my voice gave her permission to hope for something different. I shared my own fears. The loneliness, the relief, the weight lifting when I finally said enough. We talked about the subtle ways we had been manipulated, the invisible wounds no one saw. It was the first conversation where we didn't have to pretend. We laughed quietly over the absurdity of it all, cried softly at the memories. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying this burden alone. It wasn't about fixing the family anymore. It was about fixing ourselves. In that moment, I knew the fight wasn't just mine anymore. Casey was waking up too. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something real. I finalized every legal paper I could find. I removed my name from the family trust, withdrew any fallback powers, and signed off on Josh's divorce paperwork without hesitation. It was the quietest rebellion I'd ever mounted. No one saw the meetings with lawyers, the hours spent poring over documents, or the weight lifted with every signature. It wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about reclaiming my life one page at a time. When I found the letter from Mom, folded carefully and left on my kitchen counter, I didn't feel the sting of old wounds. There was no bitterness in me anymore. Just a gentle acceptance that some chapters are meant to close without fanfare. I carried the letter outside that night and watched the flames curl as the paper burned. The fire whispered away the years of silence, guilt, and obligation. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just let it go. Changing the locks was more than a practical step. It was a metaphor for everything I was leaving behind. I wasn't locking them out. I was locking myself into a space where I could finally breathe without fear. There was peace in the quiet that followed. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the subtle kind that seeps into your bones and tells you it's okay to rest. Healing wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a slow, steady unfolding. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not defined by their expectations or their pain, but by the calm I'd earned with every step away. I spent years trying to make them hear me. Not because I was silent, but because they never truly wanted to listen. Every time I spoke up, my words were cut off, dismissed, or twisted into something to mock. I remember moments when I gathered courage to share how I felt, only to be met with sighs or sarcastic smiles. The conversations never stayed mine. They became battles I didn't choose, where my truth was diluted or ignored. I was left wondering if my voice ever mattered at all. Now I see it clearly. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the space forced upon me by those who refused to acknowledge my pain. It was a role I never asked for, but was trained to perform so well that even I began to believe I had no other choice. Being unheard is a quiet kind of loneliness. It doesn't shout or demand attention. It seeps in slowly, dimming your light until you wonder if it ever shone in the first place. But silence doesn't erase the truth. It only hides it until you find the strength to speak again. And I have. Not because they finally listened, but because I finally chose to listen to myself. I learned that being seen isn't about others recognizing you. It's about standing steady enough to see yourself. That realization changed everything. That morning, I walked Nevaeh to school for the first time without a knot in my stomach. It wasn't out of obligation or guilt. I was there because she asked. And I chose to be. She held my hand tightly, skipping every few steps as if the world was a playground just for us. At the school gate, she looked up with those wide, curious eyes and asked if I would come to her birthday party this year. I crouched down to meet her gaze and said, "Only if I'm invited." She smiled and ran inside, her laughter weaving into the morning air like sunlight through trees. I stood there a moment longer, watching her disappear into the crowd of colorful backpacks and bright voices. For the first time, I felt the swirl of old ties loosen around me. The past wasn't a shadow trailing my steps anymore. It was a chapter closed quietly and firmly. Peace had arrived, not with demands or conditions, but as a gentle presence settling over the spaces I once filled with doubt and fear. Walking back home. The city felt different. The cold air was sharper but clearer. I didn't carry the weight of expectations or silent rules anymore. Instead, I carried hope, a steady kind of freedom that whispered, I was exactly where I needed to be. That moment wasn't an ending. It was a new beginning. A chance to write my story with open pages and a hand steady enough to hold the pen. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready. Have you ever had to choose peace over people? To decide that protecting your own well-being matters more than holding on to a relationship that drains you? If you have, you're not alone. I want to invite you to share your story. What was it like to say no when everyone expected yes? How did it feel to finally set a boundary that others didn't want to respect? Your voice matters here. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It's the bravest act of love you can give yourself. When you protect your peace, you create space for healing, growth, and real connection. Sometimes the hardest part is accepting that not everyone will understand your decision. Some will call it betrayal. Some will question your motives. But remember, your peace is not negotiable. If this story has touched you, please leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what peace means to you. I read every word because together, we build a community that holds space for healing. You deserve to write your next chapter with courage and grace. You deserve to be heard, to be valued, and to be free. And no matter what anyone says, choosing peace is never wrong.